Okay, now it's 4:30, so I think it's time to get started. Okay, so thanks everybody for coming here today. I know it's the last session, and then it's probably must be a long day for everybody. So, but just thinking about after another 40 minutes, then the food and drink waiting for you, and you can go to the party, right? It's great, right? So, anyway, so. We are going to talk about the new data transfer tool we are developing for the Apache Sqoop project and the so-called Sqoop 2. Okay. First, I'd like to introduce who we are, and my name is Bilong Lee. I'm currently one of the committers in the Apache Sqoop project, and I'm also the software engineer at Cloudera. And this is Catherine Tin, and she's also a committer for the Apache Sqoop project, as well as the manager at Cloudera. Okay, so the name of the Sqoop comes from the sequel to Hadoop. Okay, as the name suggested, it was originally designed to get the data into Hadoop from relational database. But as time goes by, you know the user always wanting more and more, right? So now current Sqoop actually support both import-export with relational database, such as Oracle, MySQL, PostgreSQL, to name a few, and also the enterprise data warehouse, such as the Netezza or Teradata, and also the non-SQL system, such as HBase. We actually also get some interest for other systems to support. And not only can Sqoop get your data into the Hadoop distributed file system, the so-called HDFS, it can also help you further get the data into Hive or HBase. Okay? And also the Sqoop provides integration with Woozy, which is a workflow or connection system for Apache job. And so far, I'm kind of talking more from a user perspective. So now let's take a look what Sqoop can do for you from a developer perspective. Let's say that you have developed your own high-performance data store, right? And let's say you want to somehow provide an integration with Hadoop. So you can actually implement or develop your own so-called connector based on the pluggable architecture provided by Sqoop. So it's pretty easy to do that. So that's another feature provided by Sqoop. Okay. Below is a brief timeline showing the Sqoop history. As you can see that the Sqoop recently, on the right-hand side, as you can see, the Sqoop recently celebrated its graduation as the Apache top-level project thanks to the community effort. Okay. So now I'd like to go into a little bit the architecture side of the Sqoop. So the current Sqoop is the client-only architecture, which means that the user type in the command, and the Sqoop acts as the client to submit a job to Hadoop for execution. And these jobs are map only. And inside this job, they interact with the external system on the right-hand side, and that can be the relational database or enterprise data warehouse or other system. Okay, and also, like I mentioned, that the map inside the Sqoop, it may also further populate the data into the HDFS or Hive or HBase. Okay, while this architecture is very simple, but there are also many challenges or feedbacks or comments we are getting from the field. And one of them is that those command line arguments, the user type, may implicitly determine which connector may be used underneath, which means that the choice of connector actually may be implicit. So this may come as a surprise to the user. For this kind of like Catherine will elaborate and go into detail later on. And also, like I mentioned, those Sqoop jobs are map only. So that means that all the functionality are somehow jam-packed within that mapper. So this including the data transfer, data transformation, or loading the data. So This somehow doesn't give the connector enough flexibility to reuse the common functionality. So that means that if you are trying to do a new connector, you somehow may need to implement the same functionality over again. So that's not ideal. And also another common issue we got from the field or the user is the security. Right? Currently, to access the Hadoop, you can use those security provided by Hadoop. But to access internal systems, such as the relational database or data warehouse, you somehow have to provide a username and password. Again, that's not ideal, right? And other than this, there's pretty much no other security mechanism supported in Hadoop, in Sqoop so far. And also, like I mentioned, the current Sqoop is a client-only architecture, which means that if you want, after you install the Sqoop on all the machine you like to install, you pretty much have to somehow configure the Sqoop on all the machine. And apparently, it's not very easy to manage, right? And also, the last issue, or not the least issue, is that as it was originally designed to work with relational database, it somehow followed the DBC model. It may need the table name or need a URL, those kind of things. But as the NoSQL system going popular, right? So it's not really that nature to support getting the data in and out of those non-SQL systems. So they also become a challenge how to support those systems. So these are the motivations that we like to address and those challenges we encounter in the current Sqoop. So in Sqoop 2, we are going to redesign the whole architecture into a client-server model. So this means that the user type in the command through the SQL client, and the SQL client send the commands to the SQL server, and then the SQL server, sorry, but it's not SQL, it's Sqoop. Keep saying SQL. So anyway, so the Sqoop client send a command to the Sqoop server, and the Sqoop server submit the job to Hadoop for execution. And now the job we are going to implement will leverage the power of both mapper and reducer. So this means that it will somehow give a way to cleanly separate the connector-dependent functionality and also the common functionality. And also, same thing here is inside the mapper, it can interact with the external system, and then it can further, like in the reducer, it can somehow go in through those kind of data transformation phase and populate the data into Hive or HBase, those kind of things. So, any questions so far? Okay, it's good. It's very easy, huh? Okay, so the next I'm going to turn over to Kathleen, and then she's going to continue.
Thanks, Bilan. As we've mentioned, Sqoop 2 is a work in progress. And when I say work in progress, I mean exactly that. We're holding weekly conference calls to discuss the design. So if any of you are interested in shaping Sqoop 2, the previous architectural model is what we intend, right? But the actual implementation is still up in the air. And we welcome all of you to share your input and your ideas. And please come talk to us afterwards if any of you are interested. Those of you who have used Sqoop, look at these bullet points and recognize why these are pain points for Sqoop 1, right? Sqoop is for power users. It was intended, as Bilan mentioned, for importing data to and from SQL, right? It was meant from Hadoop to SQL and back. That was the scope of Sqoop 1. The scope of Sqoop 2 is going to be significantly different. We're still going to be targeting power users, but we're also going to be targeting the new ones to Sqoop, just like Hadoop now is becoming easier to use, Sqoop 2 will be easier to use significantly. It will be easier to extend in terms of connector development, and it will be more secure. And we're going to talk about these 3 points in this presentation. Ease of use. Sqoop 1 had a client-only architecture. Sqoop 2 will have a client-server architecture, as you saw from the previous architectural diagram. By being a client-server architecture, Sqoop 2 will allow you to configure and install once and then run anywhere. Currently, a pain point I hear often, so I'm a support manager at Cloudera, and a pain point I hear often from customers as well as from those in the community is, I want to run Sqoop, but I don't want to have to install Hive on every Sqoop node. And we've heard your pain. We hear you, and coming in Sqoop 2, you're no longer required to do that. Similarly, Sqoop 1 right now is completely command line interface driven, which is great if you know what you're typing, if you know what you're doing, if you know what options to put in, if you know what options play well together. But for those of us who don't, we're going to have this interactive GUI UI, which will gray out any options not applicable to your use case. So you only have to add in information that's relevant to your use case for your particular database, and you won't inadvertently end up using options that will cause errors. Also, by having this client-server architecture, we will permit Hive and HBase to only be installed on the Sqoop server and then be able to be used anywhere, instead of having to install it on every node. Also, with Oozie right now, it's not as it's not intuitive, it's not easy to debug if you have an Oozie workflow containing a Sqoop job. Going forward, we're going to expose the REST API for Oozie and other external systems, so it will be significantly easier to debug. And we'll talk about these points in greater detail. Like other client-side tools, Sqoop requires everything: connectors, root privileges, drivers, database connectivity to be installed and configured locally, which is an unnecessary burden on your typical Sqoop user. Sqoop 2 will be a service, and as such, you can install once and then run everywhere, as I mentioned before. This means that connectors will be configured in one place, managed by the admin role, and run by the operator role. And Bilan will be talking in greater detail on why we've designed that and how it will come to play. Likewise, the JDBC drivers will be in one place. Database connectivity will only be required on the server. So as you can see from this diagram, it's going to be significantly easier to use for Sqoop users. Sqoop 1 was intended for power users, as evidenced by its command line interface. Sqoop 2 will have two modes. One for the power user. We're going to keep that CLI, and it's going to, in addition, have a web-based interactive GUI UI, which I alluded to earlier, which basically means that as you put in your Sqoop import command and you put into options, it will actually tell you what options you need to put pertaining to your use case, rather than you telling Sqoop what you need. Sqoop will tell you, okay, if you're trying to connect to MySQL, this is what you need. If you're trying to do a Hive import, this is what you need, and only this. In Sqoop 1, Hive and HBase required local installation. Oozie even required bundling, required Sqoop be bundled into it and then run on the cluster, which, as you can imagine, is very error-prone and difficult to debug. Often I've heard from users, my Sqoop command runs fine. When I run it from the command line, the Sqoop import command runs perfectly fine. As soon as I bundle it into an Oozie workflow, everything just goes berserk, and I don't know what's going on. You know, is it Sqoop? Is it Oozie? And more often than not, it's some Oozie syntax issue. You know, there's too many spaces. You're using Deron parameters, etc. There wasn't a closing brace. So these are issues that the Sqoop users should not need to debug. Sqoop users should not have to debug Oozie issues, right? That's a whole other component, and that's something we recognize and we're fixing in Sqoop 2. With Sqoop 2, Hive and HBase integration happens not from the client, but from the back end. In fact, Hive doesn't even need to be installed on Sqoop at all. What Sqoop will do is submit requests to the Hive server over the wire. And for Oozie, by exposing a REST API for integration and management, Sqoop will integrate a lot better with external systems, such as Oozie. Furthermore, Oozie and Sqoop will be decoupled, meaning that if you currently, right now, if you install a new Sqoop connector, you need to install it in Oozie as well. which is an unnecessary step and something we're addressing in Sqoop 2. As mentioned previously, the main takeaway from this slide is that Sqoop 2 will be a client-server architecture. And as a result, you get this web UI in addition to the CLI. You get this ability to install once and run from anywhere. Before I continue to ease of extension, are there any questions on ease of use? Ease of extension. Currently, with Sqoop connectors, development is very geared towards a JDBC domain, meaning that if your connector happens to fall into that domain, has that parlance, has that vocabulary, it's almost like this was meant to be, right? But as soon as you have something that's not a relational database, such as, for example, Couchbase, all of a sudden you're forced to use vocabulary that doesn't even apply to your particular use case. And Sqoop 1, since it wasn't meant for non-relational databases, it doesn't count for that. Sqoop 2 will. As mentioned, because Sqoop is heavily JDBC-centric, it's not easy to work with non-relational databases. As a result, often there are inconsistencies between connectors, and new functionality may not be available. So we have this forward compatibility issue in Sqoop 1. With Sqoop 2, the main difference is it's now going to be a two-phase approach. We now have a data transfer approach and a data transform phase. So a data transfer phase and a transform phase. There also will be the option to opt out of downstream processing. So in essence, you're reverting back to Sqoop 1. And for those who are power users, you're going to want that faster performance. And we understand that. And as a community, we decided that we're going to keep that ability to revert back to Sqoop 1. That said, you'll notice that this trade-off is worth it. What you sacrifice a little bit in performance, you're going to make up for greatly in terms of ease of connector and tooling development. And by making it easier to develop connectors on Sqoop, Sqoop will be much more robust. By separating the data transfer, the map phase from the data transform, the reduce phase, we allow connectors to specialize. Also, we're abstracting out the common framework of functionality, so you don't have to worry about forward compatibility anymore in Sqoop 2. These two commands are essentially identical, except for one thing. The second command has a driver option. And this is something I've seen time and time again, so much so that we went ahead and included it in the Sqoop troubleshooting guide, because it's actually very non-intuitive. You would think, actually, when I first saw it, I thought, well, if I'm specifying the driver option, I'm telling Sqoop, hey, I want to use the specialized connector. But it's actually the opposite. If you specify the driver command, you're actually telling Sqoop, hey, use the generic JDBC connector. And this is a common pain point of Sqoop and something we're addressing in Sqoop 2, where you have these non-intuitive options that you have no one to hold your hand to tell you what it means when you specify certain options. And as a result, you have unpredictable results. Furthermore, with Sqoop 1, as you can see from this previous slide, what Sqoop 1 will do is infer from that connect string, looking at that JDBC URL, it will infer from that, oh, you want to connect to MySQL. And that's great, but it's also error prone. And by attempting to predict which driver. So this is something that Sqoop 2 is going to resolve, in that no longer will the choice of connector be implicit, but the user will explicitly specify which database to access. As I alluded to earlier with Couchbase, Couchbase doesn't need to specify a table name. But because of the JDBC-centric Sqoop requirement, what Couchbase the connector ended up doing was the table option got overloaded as a backfill or dump operation, which again is not intuitive. So as you can see, this theme is that Sqoop is great. It does bulk transfer very well, but it takes some getting used to, and we want to help new users be able to get up to speed on Sqoop a lot faster. and which is the point of making it easier to develop connectors, making it easier to use. With the user making explicit connector choice in Sqoop 2, it will be less error-prone and more predictable. Connectors are no longer forced to follow the JDBC model and no longer forced to use this common JDBC vocabulary if it doesn't apply. For instance, URL, database table, if that vocabulary doesn't apply to the connector you're developing, you won't need to use that anymore, which will make for a more intuitive usage of Sqoop. Common functionality will be abstracted out of connectors, holding them responsible only for data transport. This reduced phase will implement common functionality, ensuring that connectors benefit from future development of functionality. This way, developers only need to focus on the data transfer part, and they won't need to know knowledge of other databases, right? They only need to worry about how do I connect my database to Sqoop instead of thinking, well, these other databases are connected to Sqoop in this way. How do I support that functionality as well? That will be taken care of in Sqoop 2. As mentioned in the previous slides, Sqoop 2's connector development will be significantly easier for a couple reasons. One, we're decoupling Sqoop from the JDBC domain. Two, connectors will benefit from a common framework and functionality. We're abstracting that out. The connector developer only needs to focus on the data transfer part. And three, by having the user explicitly specify the connector, we can cut down on a lot of errors where you meant to connect to one database and Sqoop thought otherwise. Before I turn over to Bilan to talk about security, are there any questions on ease of extension?
Okay, so thanks, Catherine. So now I'm going to go over the security aspect of the Sqoop. So I'm going to first talk about the overall picture of the security, and then I'll probably go into a little bit further on the external system access and then the resource management policy. Okay, so in the current Sqoop, to access the Hadoop, so you can use those security mechanisms already provided by Hadoop. For example, you can get the kernel principal and pass along the principal through Sqoop and to access the Hadoop jobs. And also, you can also use the HDFS security to control the file access. But pretty much those are already provided by Hadoop. And to access the external system, you have to provide the username and password, and it's very limited. And other than this, there are pretty much no other security mechanisms provided currently in Sqoop. So in Sqoop 2, so we are going to address this issue, and we are going to keep allowing the user to continue using those security mechanisms already provided by Hadoop to access Hadoop. On top of that, as the starting point, we are also going to provide the role-based access control to access the external system. For example, we may have the administrator role, which can create, edit, or delete the connection. And on the other hand, we will also have an operator role, and they can only use the connection. So there will be a clear separation of the administrator versus operator. So unlike now, pretty much you have to give the user username and password. There's no distinction between which user you are given to. And now let's go into a little bit detail on the external system access. So like I mentioned, currently, when you invoke the Sqoop command, every invocation you have to provide the username and password in order to access external files, external system, such as the relational database. If it's a relational database, you probably know that the DBA won't like that, right? They don't really want to give you the username and password, and then they can access everything. So one common workaround right now is the DBA may somehow create a specialized user with limited access, and they give the username and password to that one specific person and then allow him to or her to access the scoop to run the job. But apparently, this approach is not really scalable, and because the DBA may need to create more and more users as time goes by, and also it's not easy to manage. It's not that manageable. So also in current Sqoop, it's very hard to prevent the user from abusing the credential, username, password to doing anything else. Because I think once you give them the username, password, and there's no way you can somehow prevent them from doing it. You can only trust them in good faith. And so in Sqoop 2, and we are going to address this by introducing the connection as a first-class object, in the sense that the credential itself are embedded inside a connection object. And then with that, you don't really need to hand out the credential to every user. You only need to give them access to the connection. And also, once the connections are created, they can be reused, right? So increase the reusability. And also, the connection can only be created by administrator, and then can only used by operator. Or operator are only allowed. Operator are only allowed to use them. They cannot create the connection. So this means that when the administrator creates a connection, they can decide what privilege they want to give the connection. And then when the operator uses those connections, they are bound by those rules set forth by the administrator. So in a way, so this somehow restricts the connection in a certain scope. So for example, as an administrator, you may decide you want to create a connection only to allow a certain user to do the import-only job. So you create a connection, and with only the read access to, for example, like the underneath database. So in that case, when the operator uses that connection, then he can only do the import job. He is not allowed to do the export job. So he cannot abuse that connection to do anything else he is not allowed to do. So it provides some security to that. Okay, so now let's take a look at the resource manager a little bit further. So currently in Sqoop, there's no resource management policy. So in the sense that I think one common issue faced by the user is when they are somehow trying to access external relational database, there's no way they can control how many underneath physical connection can open to access the relational database, because it's usually complained by the DBA there are way too many connections, and if somehow the user and specify way too many mapper. And one workaround is the Sqoop user may somehow try to specify the number of mapper to run. But again, this is not really ideal because it doesn't really specify how many actual physical connection underneath to access the relational database. And so this cannot really throttle the load to the external system. So in order to address this, so we are going to allow the user to explicitly specify the resource management policy. So in a way, we are going to let the administrator specify, for example, like the total number of physical connections they allow to access the underneath external system, such as the relational database. And also, like in the current Sqoop, once you hand out the user or password to a user, and then you probably cannot take it back, right? Unless you change the password or you revoke the user. If you change your password, then you're probably afraid that, okay, somehow the user may somehow got impacted or something like that. So anyway, so in the Sqoop 2, so we are going to allow the administrator to disable a connection if they decide, okay, it's no longer in use, or for some reason, some person, and then they don't want it to use it anymore. So it's more flexible. So in summary, in current Sqoop, the security mechanism provided pretty much just limited on those provided by Hadoop. If you want to access, if you are going to access Hadoop, and when you access in Hadoop. But when you access in the external system, you have to provide a username and password in the current Sqoop. So in Sqoop 2, So we are going to introduce as the starting point the role-based access control with the administrator and operator, allow the user have a to have a different role and to access external system. So this way, we'll kind of give more flexibility there and also more secure model there. And also in the current Sqoop, it will higher, once you hand out the username and password, so the higher risk that the user may abuse the credential they may be using, right? So in the Sqoop 2, so with the new role-based access control, so it will reduce the risk of doing so. And also in the current Sqoop, there's no resource management policy. And then compared to that, in Sqoop 2, then we are going to allow the user to explicitly specify what kind of resource management policy they want to use. Okay. So any questions so far? Or everybody just tired? Or just so eager to go to the party? So anyway, so I'm going to continue. So now I'm going to show you a few screen slides taken from the run of the current Sqoop 2. Keep in mind that the Sqoop 2 is still a work in progress. And then everything's out there already in the Apache repository. So you can download it if you are interested. You can. I just want to show you it's very easy to access to it and download it, play with it, and then give it a try. And you are interested. And even better, if you have any good idea, and you are welcome to contribute back to the community and then or discuss with any of us and or any of the committer. So anyway, so the first step, as always, you can somehow use Subversion and to check out the code. Simple step. And the next thing is just like many other Hadoop-related projects, we use Maven. You can use the Maven and type in the Maven command to build a binary and doing the thing there and building the code, compile the code, etc., something like that. Once it's done, as kind of Kathleen mentioned before, and Sqoop 2 now will be in the client-server model. So the first thing you will need to do after you build the binary is you have to stop the Sqoop server. And then we have the Sqoop provided there, we have the script provided there. You type in the command, and then you will stop the Sqoop server in Tomcat. And now the Tomcat is there because kind of to facilitate the development process. It's not really required because the Sqoop server itself is actually a web application. So you can actually develop the Sqoop server onto any web container you prefer. There's also the same script. You can invoke the client there, and then there's a few command there, simple command there is already there, and then you can play with it and have fun there. So, okay, so any question? If not, I'm going to turn over to Kathleen.
Thanks, Bilan. We covered 3 things today in our presentation in terms of Sqoop 2 highlights. 1, Sqoop 2 will be a lot easier to use, and this is because Sqoop 2 will have a client-server architecture. And because of that, we can have the ability to install once, configure once, run from anywhere. Second, there will be a significant ease of extension for connector developers by having the shared functionality abstracted out, so developers only need to worry about data transfer. In addition, no longer will the connector developer be tied to a JDBC-centric vocabulary. And lastly, security. This is something I've heard a lot in the field. I know people are concerned about this, and rightly so, about having their password in clear text, for instance, right? Obviously, a concern, something we're going to address in terms of connections as first-class objects and in role-based security, as Bilan mentioned. Here are some links that we hope you can all go check out to talk more about Sqoop 2 development. As mentioned, we have this weekly conference call. So here's your opportunity to shape Sqoop 2 and make Sqoop 2 what you want it to be, to fit your use case. And more links. The first one is a quick start guide. So if you want to get Sqoop 2 up and running, just like Bilan showed in those screenshots, just follow that first quick start link, and it lists all of the commands that you can run. Links about resource layout, potential feature requests. These are some things we talk about during the weekly conference call. So feel free to check those out too. If you're a developer, if you're a tester, if you're a docs person, a program manager, if you're a user of Sqoop, we want you. We need you to make Sqoop 2 easier to use, easier to extend, and more secure. We have a meetup tonight to discuss Sqoop 2, Sqoop 1, anything you want to discuss Sqoop related, tonight at 6:30 at the Hilton San Jose. Bilal and I will be up here for any questions. Feel free to ask us now or at the meetup. Thank you all.